Good afternoon, everybody. That was an excellent panel and it's a hard act to follow. I look forward to talking a little bit about the technology side of things here. And I'm George Roberts from TechScale Solutions and be talking about how to turn your prototypes into products. We'll start with the new technology dilemma that faces a lot of companies that are innovating. They're coming up with new products, new ideas. How do you get them out of the lab and how do you actually scale them up and make them a commercial viable product? We'll talk a little bit about how TechScale Solutions was founded, the process we use with our clients to develop and get them from that starting line all the way out to the finish and have a viable commercial product. We'll look at 3 case studies. The case studies, I really want to give you some examples of how you can apply these areas of expertise. And finally, some keys you can take away for your own successes as you start to scale up your technologies. It's exciting times in the world of clean energy. Over the past decade, a little over past decade, we've seen a lot of activity in electricity, in solar, wind, energy storage. And now we're really starting to see a lot of momentum happening in the hydrogen space. We're not there yet. There's still a lot of innovation that has to happen, but it's making great progress, and we're on the right track here. And as we've seen here today, there's a lot going on. Many of you have seen this in various forms. This is the National Clean Hydrogen Strategy that's been put out by the Department of Energy. And it takes a look at how do we use the technology today in a high impact uses. So things like transportation, heavy vehicles, chemicals, other kinds of fuels early on that we can actually leverage the technology today. Later on, not too far later on, we have to get the cost down. We're trying to get to $1 per kilogram by the year 2031, which really isn't that far away. And then focusing on regional networks, we expect an announcement in the next matter of days or weeks on hydrogen hubs. That'll be very exciting to see that scale. So again, to make all this happen, we heard there's a lot of policy, there's a lot of finance, there's a lot of different areas, but there's still a lot of innovation and technology that has to catch up with this. And that's really where we at TechScale Solutions work. We work in that technology space and figure out how do we make the technology work for those applications and how do you actually scale it to these very large, lofty goals that we're looking for now in terms of scale. So when you come up with a new product, you're faced with all kinds of challenges. First of all, what is the product going to do in terms of the scale? What's it need to cost? How are you going to manufacture it? Where do you buy the parts to put it together? And there's a lot of steps to get through, and you could think of it as a marathon perhaps, where if you just keep slugging along, eventually you'll get there and then you'll have your product. Unfortunately, that's not how it usually works. What often happens is much more like an obstacle course. You get these situations where you'll have your product defined and you're moving along and you find out maybe the market shifted, maybe policy shifted, maybe the technology isn't there yet, your efficiencies aren't where they need to be. Maybe the supply base isn't ready to make parts that are this big, so you can only make parts that are this big. So you have to be agile, you have to be ready to move, ready to react to the situation, but you can't stay stagnant, because if you stay stagnant, what happens many times I've seen in the industry, engineers and scientists are really smart people. The problem is they oftentimes like to iterate and iterate and iterate and make something perfect, which in academia that's okay to a point, but in a commercial business you have to lock that product in, move it forward. There's always going to be next generation, there's always going to be continuous improvement, and you'll be building them in onto future products. So that'll continue to happen in the future, but as you're working through right now, you really need to kind of manage yourself through that obstacle course and get to the other side. So I'll talk a little bit about how I founded TechScale Solutions. I founded the company in 2014. Prior to that, I was an engineering manager at UTC Power, division of UTC United Technologies, where we did a lot of work with automotive OEMs and heavy vehicles such as buses on fuel cell deployments. And technology was successful, it worked. We set some very impressive durability achievements. Problem was it never really it was ahead of its time. It was never quite there in terms of the market to really pick that up and move forward. So fast forwarding, I moved to a small company where it was much more nimble, moving quickly. It was a company called Hynine Corporation where we were doing purification of hydrogen. That was the other extreme. Things are trying to move quickly. You don't have that structure of a big company and thinking through all those details. And I recognize there's kind of a disconnect in the industry, and that's what brought me to find TechScale Solutions. Trying to take the rigor and the process of a big company and combine that with the agility of a small company to get things done in an efficient manner. And one of the areas, of course, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, is safety. We're working with hydrogen. It's a combustible gas. You've got to be careful with that. We want to make sure our designs are safe. We don't want to ever deploy anything that doesn't have that full engineering thought process behind it. So we typically at TechScale Solutions engage directly with the client. Sometimes we're embedded with the client, actually almost as if you're a management or project manager or interim manager is a word that's used frequently. And work with both their engineering teams, but also their business development teams to define what the product can do, what does it need to do, and all those back and forths to get to the point of looking at manufacturing, legal supplies, safety, as we mentioned. And we bring in people as necessary to help in those different areas. But more importantly, we're helping to grow that company and bring in the people that they need to be successful. We're not a recruiter. We don't get commissions for bringing in people. It's really just trying to be the matchmaker to build the teams, whether it's suppliers, whether it's teammates or engineering services, those type of things. So if we look at, this is just a quick schematic of kind of the process we follow. There's really 6 steps, starting with the client prototype shown here in yellow at the first step, going all the way out to the end of the process. And we engage with clients at different points. Sometimes we'll engage right at the beginning. If someone has a brand new prototype, they want to scale it up. So we'll start with working with the engineering team and their business group and maybe even customers to define what that product needs to do and what is the cost points, things like that. Then we look at how do you actually design it, and then how do you get some of the cost out of it so you can at least have an early adoption with that product. Thinking about the manufacturing, oftentimes in this industry, the volumes are low at first. You don't want to build a giant factory that's all fully automated day one. But you want to think about that because that could be out in the future. So sizing your manufacturing for the volumes that you expect in the near term is very important. And that goes for the suppliers too. We're developing the supply base. We can't be buying things out of catalogs. We actually have to have real suppliers, bills of materials, quality plans, and a reliable source of those supplies, and in many cases, multiple sources of those supplies. And then finally, we move through product launch, as it sounds, making sure all the documentation is in place and they're able to service that equipment as it's put out into the field. So I'll start now and I'll talk about 3 different cases with 3 companies that I've worked with. In respect to the non-disclosure agreements, I don't disclose their names or any proprietary information, but I think they'll give you a good example of the types of engagements we work with and how they've been successful to date. This first case was a small alternative energy startup. They were basically reforming natural gas with a plasma process, and they had demonstrated it at very small scale. It worked great. Technically, it looked like a good thing. They brought TechScale in to take a look at that and see how you could actually scale it. And we developed the product requirements, talking to the engineering staff, what can this thing do? Then working with the end customers, and we identified a market it would be for telecom backup. So basically, it would make hydrogen to feed a fuel cell out of a remote cell tower. So it's a 5 to 10 kilowatt application. Quickly, as we started doing the economics, it didn't pan out on paper. We were in a situation where you could technically scale it up, but the economics weren't there. So it didn't make sense to pursue that. So that's always a hard conversation with inventors. You're talking about, this is your baby, and we can't move forward with this. You can move forward with this, but it wouldn't be wise to move forward with this. But in this case, we're able to look at an alternate technology that was able to still make the hydrogen, still work for their application, and they were able to move forward and be successful. So in this case, we kind of got through the first steps here with the product definition and the cost reduction, and then they were able to work with, actually it was another partner company that had that technology that helped them go through the rest of that process. So we were in on the early side of that one, but it was an example of being able to stop them from going too far down the wrong path. So the takeaway from that is that you want to evaluate those product requirements early, make sure it's viable, and don't ever force fit a technology just because you have it available to you. The next example is an early stage electrolyzer company. They had an electrolyzer that was maybe this big, not many cells, and they wanted to make it about this big. So we had to figure out how do we actually size that, how do we build that up. Their team was really experts in the electrochemistry and some of the layers and materials that they put in there, but they hadn't done things at that large scale. So we worked through the product requirements with them. We built out the team. In this case, we look at areas where they have the technical expertise in-house. The electrochemistry was great. They may not have had the mechanical engineering to do some of the design of the stack, so we could bring in those expertise to help them. And then other areas that were key to them to be able to scale and move forward, some of the testing and things, they hired people into those areas, so we helped them kind of define what was required to make their team successful. and they continue to grow that company. We followed the same type of process with design reviews and safety analyses, and we iterated. So we tested, we moved back through the supply chain, we looked at the manufacturing, so we could be agile. Initially, we're machining parts. It's expensive to machine parts, but you don't want to mold parts until you get into high volume. So starting to think about that down the road, how you would get there. And so at the end of this, basically, again, you want to be challenging. You don't want to set low goals. You got to push hard. Sometimes you need multiple paths because one of those paths won't pan out. Then you also look at staging, as I mentioned before, the supply chain. So maybe the suppliers you buy from today may not be the same suppliers later, but you want to have those strategic relationships in place so your suppliers can grow with you, and they can teach you a lot too. The suppliers have done this before in a lot of cases, and they may be able to help you in areas where you don't know a tolerance of a material. What are they capable of doing? They can guide you so you're not reinventing that wheel. The final case I'll talk about is a large energy storage company. This group was doing a flow battery. So again, it's still an electrochemical stack. Instead of making hydrogen, it's using a liquid that's basically storing energy, then it runs in reverse and takes the electricity back out. They had defined the product. They knew what they needed to make, but they didn't know how to get it through those final steps. So we, again, worked with them on the product definition, but really where we were focused on is more the operational side. How do you start manufacturing? Where do you find those suppliers? It turned out that a lot of the core competency in a lot of these companies, you want to keep that intellectual property internal. So you might make those parts yourself in-house, but other parts you might get their sub-assemblies, for example, that come in and you do a final assembly, much like an automotive company would do today. So making those decisions along the way is very critical to lay out the path and then ultimately the cost structure for that. Again, we've made sure the documentation was there. Quality plans are important because you need to be able to understand what you're getting from the supplier and that they're giving you what you expect and it's going to work as you intend. And then finally, we tested it, brought it out to full scale, and it was actually a very successful project. So in the case here, again, those project plans are important. Setting those expectations. It's important for the investors of the company. It's important for the team to have everybody rowing the boat in the same direction. And it's also very important to keep you focused so you can get to the end goal. And wherever you can, leverage those external resources. You don't have to be good at everything. You have to know what you're good at and then know where to look to find those experts in the other parts of the field. So that's just a quick run through of a couple cases. And as we look at this, I think the takeaway message for all of you is that every project is a little bit different. There's always going to be variations of how you approach each individual question. But overall, these 4 areas are kind of very important areas I would encourage you all to think about in your own product development going forward. Defining that product very clearly, making sure it's well understood by both the customer and the team that's building it, and recognizing where that boundary is, that we're not going to keep iterating on that. We're going to push this forward, get it in the field, get some experience. Focus on a single product. It can be exciting to try to do everything with one product or maybe have a multitude of products, but if you can't get the first one right, you're wasting a lot of energy working on all those other ones at the same time. So trying to focus is important. Cost reduction is important in terms of trying to keep, not just beating down suppliers. It's really a lot of times it's looking at the design that you're working on. How do you simplify that design? How do you get the same function for a lower cost? Leveraging their experience too, because as I mentioned before, the suppliers have done things like this before. They may actually have some ideas you can utilize. Figuring out your manufacturing and supplier strategy. Do you make things? Do you buy things? Collaboration with those suppliers. And it's working together. That's been a theme I think I've heard over the past 2 days here. This whole industry is growing, and we all really need to work together to be successful. We can't do anything all by ourselves, so it's important to be able to do this as a larger group of people. And then finally, once you launch the product, get it to the point where it's well documented. You will have problems in the field. You want to be able to bring it back in, look at that data, make changes, improve upon your product, and then just continue on from there. So that's the end of my presentation. I've got about 30 seconds or so. If there's maybe one question, I'd be happy to answer that. And then afterwards, I'll be outside right outside the doors there. I'd be happy to answer those as well.
Customer feedback in your process? You go back to your...
Yes.
I was just looking at your steps.
Steps, yep. Yeah, so his question was, is there customer feedback in that process? And there is, and I guess I oversimplified in this picture for the purpose of this, but that's very important. So the business development groups, those are the people that are out talking to the customer and feeding that back to us, so very important. Okay, any last questions? Thank you very much. I appreciate it.